My name is Serena, and I'm 34 years old. When I served tea at my father's wake, my sister smirked in front of everyone and said, "You'll never belong in this family." The room laughed. I didn't. I just smiled, because hidden in my father's will was a secret she'd spend the rest of her life regretting. The morning I drove up the winding path toward my father's mansion, the same path I'd walked barefoot as a child, I felt no warmth, only the quiet sting of returning to a place that had never really been mine. The iron gates creaked open as though reluctant to let me in. Even in death, my father's house looked down on me. The mansion stood like a marble ghost, impeccably polished, soulless, and proud. The glass windows caught the pale winter light, but no glow came from within. Every line, every perfect corner of that house whispered of Vivian, my older sister, my father's golden child. She was already waiting on the front steps, draped in black silk and smug self-importance. Even grief looked good on her. Her expression didn't soften when she saw me. It just froze, polite, controlled, and utterly insincere. "Serena," she said, voice clipped, like the syllables were a chore. "You came." I stepped out of my car, brushing the cold wind from my coat. Of course, he was my father, too. She murmured, as if the fact were debatable. The way she looked at me, half pity, half disdain, was the same as always. Growing up, she had been the reflection of everything I was not, the legitimate daughter, the favorite, the one who carried his name with pride. I was the reminder of his mistake, the product of an affair that no amount of money could erase. When I crossed the threshold, the scent of polished oak and lavender hit me. Familiar, suffocating. I remembered the countless times I'd stood in this hallway as a child, clutching my mother's hand, waiting for father to acknowledge me. Sometimes he did. Most times he didn't. Vivian gestured vaguely toward the drawing room. "You'll want to freshen up. The lawyer's coming tomorrow for the will reading. We're expecting guests this evening. Try not to make things uncomfortable." I smiled faintly. "I'll do my best not to ruin your show." Her eyes narrowed. For a brief second, I saw irritation break through the mask. Then she turned and glided away, heels clicking like punctuation marks on marble. Left alone, I looked around. The house was beautiful, but cold. Every painting, every vase, exactly where Vivian wanted it. My father's favorite chair had been moved. Even the air felt curated. It was his house, but it had become hers long before he died. I walked through the hall toward the back parlor. A maid passed me, Elena. I remembered her from years ago. She had served my father since I was little, and though she was careful, I saw the flicker of sympathy in her eyes. "Miss Serena," she whispered, "it's good I see you again." "Thank you," I replied softly. "It's good to be remembered." As I wandered through the rooms, old memories crowded in. There was the piano where Vivian once locked the cover on my fingers when I tried to play. The staircase where she'd pushed me, then cried, so father thought I fell by accident. I could still hear her voice. "You don't belong here. You never will." I thought time might dull those echoes. I was wrong. By late afternoon, the guests had started arriving. Distant relatives, family friends, faces I barely recognized, but all united by one thing, deference to Vivian. She greeted them with perfect poise, playing the role of hostess effortlessly. When she introduced me, it was always the same. "This is my half-sister Serena. She's visiting from the city." Visiting, not returning, not family, just passing through. We gathered in the grand sitting room, where servants circulated with trays of pastries and tea. Vivian took her seat at the head of the table like a queen conducting court. I remained silent, folding my hands in my lap, watching the way she orchestrated every smile and every gesture. The conversation drifted to the estate, the funeral, the value of the art collection. No one mentioned father's will, though everyone was thinking about it. Vivian glanced at me occasionally, a faint smirk ghosting her lips whenever she caught my eyes. When one of the aunts complained that the tea was cold, I rose automatically. "I'll pour fresh ones." Vivian's head snapped toward me. "No, Serena," she said, tone sharp. "The staff will handle it. You're a guest." But I walked to the tray anyway, my fingers steady, my smile perfectly calm. "I don't mind. I used to serve father's tea every afternoon when I visited. Old habits." That earned a few raised eyebrows, a few awkward glances. Vivian's jaw tightened. "How domestic of you," she murmured, loud enough for all to hear. The laughter that followed was brittle and polite, but it stung just the same. I poured the tea carefully, one cup after another, my movements deliberate. The golden liquid reflected my face, calm, composed, unreadable. I set a cup before Vivian last, meeting her eyes. She tilted her chin. "You really should stop pretending, Serena. You'll never belong here." The words landed softly, like silk draped over a knife. Around us, the room fell silent. Even the servants froze. My hand hovered above the teapot for a moment longer than necessary. Then I set it down gently and smiled. "Maybe," I said, "but belonging has never been my goal." A flicker of confusion crossed her face, just for a second. The conversation resumed, thin and forced, but I could feel the tension vibrating through the air. Every polite word was a weapon now. I sat back, sipping my own tea, tasting the bitterness I'd carried for years. As the evening wore on, Vivian basked in attention, oblivious to the shift in the room. She believed she had already won, had secured the mansion, the money, the reputation. She thought I'd come to mourn and leave quietly. But as I watched her, as I listened to her voice echo through the halls that once ignored me, a strange calm settled over me. I looked around at the walls, the portraits, the glimmering chandelier above us. My father's presence was still here, silent but powerful. And I remembered the last time I saw him, weak in his hospital bed, gripping my hand with more strength than I thought he had left. He'd whispered something then, something I'd kept secret ever since. "Don't fight her," he'd said. "Wait, let her reveal herself, then read the truth." I'd nodded, not fully understanding. Now I did. Vivian laughed at something shallow and cruel, her voice slicing through the quiet like glass. I smiled at her across the table, my face serene, my heartbeat steady. She thought this was her victory. She thought she'd put me in my place. But as I lifted my teacup, my reflection rippled in the surface, calm and unflinching. Inside, I whispered to myself, "She has no idea what I know." The next morning, I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the window pane. The mansion looked even colder under the gray sky, its perfect symmetry softened by mist, its glass eyes reflecting nothing. I dressed quietly and slipped down the hall toward my father's study, the one room in the house that had always felt like a church to him. No one followed me. They rarely did. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and the familiar scent hit me, a mix of tobacco, cedarwood, and the faintest trace of the cologne he'd worn all his life. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the desk where he'd spent endless hours building an empire, signing documents, erasing mistakes. On the shelves were the same books I'd dusted as a teenager during those brief summers he allowed me to stay. My father was a man of discipline, not affection. Love, for him, was a ledger, something to be earned, not given. And Vivian had always been better at earning it. After her mother died, she filled that empty space beside him like she was made to fit it. I remember the way she would hover near him during dinners, refilling his glass before anyone could ask. She'd smile sweetly, perform the perfect daughter, and when I reached for his attention, she'd cut me off with one glance. I was the reminder of another woman, a scandal in flesh and blood. When I was 16, Vivian told me father wanted me to attend a boarding school in Europe, a special opportunity, she'd called it. I believed her. It wasn't until years later I learned the truth. He never asked for it. She had arranged everything, convincing him I wanted to go, showing him falsified letters she'd drafted in my handwriting. And by the time I came back, the house, his life, belonged entirely to her. I walked around his desk now, trailing my fingers along the smooth surface. Everything was where he'd left it. Neatly stacked papers, a pen holder, a half-burned candle. But something about the drawers caught my attention. The one on the left wasn't fully closed. I crouched down and eased it open. Inside were folders, sealed envelopes, and receipts meticulously filed. He'd always been meticulous. My gaze drifted to a silver-framed photograph. Vivian at 16, smiling with her diploma in hand. I turned it over. Behind it, tucked against the wooden edge, was a yellowed envelope with my name written across it. Serena. The handwriting was his. For a second, my pulse stuttered. My fingers trembled as I slid it out. "Miss Serena?" a voice said softly behind me. I turned. Elena stood at the doorway, her hands clasped before her apron. "You shouldn't be in here," she whispered nervously. "If Miss Vivian finds out—" "She won't," I said, slipping the envelope into my coat pocket. "You didn't see me." Elena hesitated, then nodded. "Your father used to come here late at night, even when he was sick. He said the study kept him thinking clearly. I thought you should know." Her eyes darted toward the door, and then she left, closing it behind her. I sat at the desk, staring at that drawer again. My heart was pounding, but not from fear. Something colder. Anticipation. There was more. I could feel it. I searched the drawer more thoroughly this time, and there it was. A thin folder labeled Estate Addendum, Pending Signature. Inside were printed documents outlining property transfers, asset clauses, and handwritten notes in the margins. My father's scrawl, unmistakable. It wasn't signed, not officially, but the words made my throat tighten. In acknowledgement of my daughter Serena, rightful heir to the primary residence and holdings therein, I froze. My father had been planning to change his will. Footsteps echoed down the hall, breaking my trance. I slid the folder back, careful to hide the missing envelope space with a stack of papers. Just as I turned the key to lock the drawer, I heard Vivian's voice, sharp and rehearsed. "There you are," she said from the doorway. "Sneaking around already?" I turned slowly, my expression neutral. "I was just looking at his books." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Of course you were. You always liked pretending to be part of his world." I said nothing. Silence was safer. It unnerved her more. Behind her, a man stepped forward. His suit was expensive but understated, his expression unreadable. "Miss Vivian," he said politely. "Miss Serena. I'm Mr. Halbrook, your father's attorney." Vivian's face brightened instantly. "Mr. Halbrook, I was hoping you'd come by. You must be exhausted after the funeral. Come, let's sit in the parlor." As they turned to leave, he glanced back at me. "Miss Serena, the will reading is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Your presence will, of course, be required." I nodded, offering a faint smile. "Wouldn't miss it." Vivian placed a possessive hand on his arm. "You can send the paperwork to me directly, Mr. Halbrook. I'll handle any decisions that need to be made." The lawyer looked uneasy. "Your father's instructions were quite specific. We'll review everything in due process." I caught the twitch in Vivian's jaw before she masked it again. She hated not being in control. When they disappeared down the hall, I closed the study door and exhaled. The room suddenly felt alive, humming with the echoes of my father's presence. His portrait above the fireplace seemed to watch me, stern, knowing. "You really did plan ahead, didn't you?" I whispered. I pulled the envelope from my pocket and sat on the floor by the window. The paper was heavy, embossed with his initials. Inside, there was a single folded sheet. It wasn't a letter. It was another document, this one marked Draft Copy, Confidential. My name appeared again, linked to the estate's primary deed. Beneath it, a note in his hand. Final revision pending signature. To be delivered to Serena directly if necessary. I read it twice, then a third time, my mind racing. He knew. He'd seen through Vivian long before he died. I folded the document carefully and slipped it back into the envelope, then tucked it deep into my bag beneath the lining. My hands were cold, my pulse steady. The old clock in the corner ticked louder, slower, each second dragging the air heavier around me. Through the window, I could see Vivian and Mr. Halbrook walking toward the rose garden, her laughter sharp against the gray air. She believed she owned the world, that father's death was the final seal on her victory. But the truth sat in my hands, silent and potent. I looked up at the portrait again. "You said the truth would come after you were gone," I murmured. "And you were right." The rain picked up, drumming harder against the glass as if urging me forward. I slipped the bag over my shoulder, glanced once more at the locked drawer, and turned off the lamp. No one saw me leave the study, but as I closed the door behind me, I whispered to myself, soft, certain, and cold. He prepared me for this. The next morning dawned bright and deceptive. Sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows as if this house could ever feel warm. I walked into the dining room expecting silence, but found Vivian already seated at the head of the table, dressed in a silk robe the color of champagne. Diamonds glittered around her neck, subtle enough to look effortless, but large enough to be noticed. She was sipping orange juice, flipping through a glossy magazine. When she saw me, her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Good morning, little sister," she said. "You're up early. Couldn't sleep?" "I slept fine," I replied. "Old houses just creak differently, that's all." Vivian laughed softly, a controlled sound. "You'll get used to it, assuming you plan to stay. I'm sure Father would have wanted you to feel comfortable, even if there's not much reason for you to linger after tomorrow." Her words were casual, but they landed like darts. On the table beside her plate sat an open folder filled with estate documents, letters, and invoices, none of which she had any right to handle. But Vivian was always first to claim ownership, even of things that weren't hers yet. "Making arrangements already?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Just practicalities," she said breezily. "The staff, the vehicles, the accounts. There's so much to manage. Father left quite the legacy. I'm only making sure it stays in proper hands." "Yours, you mean?" I said quietly. Her smile didn't waver. "Naturally." Before I could answer, her husband walked in. Grant. Impeccably dressed, smugly handsome in that overconfident, expensive way. He kissed Vivian's cheek before turning to me. "Serena, always a pleasure." His eyes flicked over me, appraising, calculating. I could almost see the numbers running through his mind. Inheritance percentages, asset values, potential threats. Vivian reached out to adjust his cufflinks. "We were just talking about the will," she said sweetly. "Serena seems quite interested in how Father's estate will be divided." Grant chuckled. "I would be too in her position. These things can get complicated, especially with, family variations." Vivian feigned offense. "Grant, really." But she was smiling. "Don't worry," he added, leaning back in his chair. "I'm sure your father made provisions for everyone, maybe a trust fund or something sentimental." I took a slow sip of coffee. "I'm not here for charity, Grant." "Of course not," Vivian said quickly, her tone honeyed, but her eyes glinting. "You're here because you're family, that's all." They exchanged a look, a silent, mocking communion. For a moment I almost laughed at the predictability of it. The two of them, so sure of their throne, so blind to how brittle their kingdom really was. The servants moved around us quietly, setting down plates of fruit, toast, and eggs. Elena came to pour more coffee, and when she leaned close, she slipped a folded napkin beside my hand without a word. I waited until she left the room before unfolding it under the table. The handwriting was small, careful. "Ask for the private codicil." Codicil. I read the word twice, feeling the weight of it. A will amendment? A secret clause? My father's voice echoed in my mind. "The truth will come after I'm gone." Vivian was still talking, her voice a stream of polished vanity. "Mr. Halbrook said he'll handle everything tomorrow. I told him to use the main study, of course. It's where Father would have wanted it." "Oh, and I might donate some of his old things. They're outdated, especially those ledgers. Serena, you remember how much he hated clutter, don't you?" I smiled faintly. "I remember he hated waste." Grant smirked. "That's generous of you, Viv. Cleaning house before you even have the keys." She laughed, a brittle sound. "Preparation is power." That phrase hung in the air, and I almost thanked her for it. She didn't know how right she was. After breakfast, I slipped away to the garden patio with my phone. A few quick searches confirmed what I suspected. A private codicil could radically change a will, even override previous clauses, as long as it was properly notarized. If such a document existed, Vivian's carefully built fantasy could collapse in seconds. I sat beneath the glass canopy, pretending to scroll through messages while my mind spun faster than it had in years. The mansion's reflection shimmered in the glass table before me, beautiful, brittle, hollow. A house of mirrors. And at its center, a woman made of glass, convinced she couldn't break. When I went back inside, Vivian was in the living room, surrounded by two aunts and a family friend, performing grief like theater. She dabbed her eyes delicately with a silk handkerchief, voice trembling just enough to sound believable. "Oh, Father loved Serena, of course," she was saying, in his way. "But he always said family meant legacy, not blood, not accidents." Their laughter was polite, their eyes awkwardly averted. I stood at the doorway until she noticed me. When she did, her tone shifted instantly, sweet venom laced with pity. "Oh, Serena, we were just talking about you. Everyone was curious what you've been doing these past few years." I smiled. Surviving. Vivian tilted her head. How poetic. It must be exhausting, though. Living without the comforts you grew up watching me enjoy. The women tittered softly. My stomach tightened, but I kept my expression calm. "Not really," I said. "Comfort doesn't mean safety. Sometimes it just hides the cracks." Vivian's eyes narrowed. "Still philosophical, I see. You always did talk like you were in some tragic novel." "Maybe," I said. "But at least I learned how those stories end." The conversation stumbled, but she wasn't done. She leaned back, her tone syrupy and cruel. "You know, you do have a talent for service. Perhaps once all this is settled, I'll keep you around. You'd make a fine assistant, or perhaps the help. You've always had such a humble touch." For a second, the room went still. The servants froze in place. Even the ticking clock seemed to pause. I met her gaze, held it, then smiled, not sweetly, but like a blade sliding from its sheath. "Funny," I said softly. "You might be serving me soon." The air snapped. Vivian's smile faltered, only slightly, but enough to see the crack form. The women exchanged confused glances, unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet. Vivian finally broke the silence with a brittle laugh. "You do love your jokes, Serena. Always dreaming. Always preparing," I corrected. I left the room before she could respond, my footsteps echoing through the marble corridor. Behind me, her laughter tried to fill the space again, but it rang hollow, like glass under strain. By the time I reached the hallway, I could still feel her eyes on my back. That single sentence, "You might be serving me soon," had lodged itself inside her, sharp and impossible to ignore. And for the first time since I'd returned, I saw something flicker in her perfect composure. Fear. The following morning, the mansion felt like a stage before the curtain rose. Every sound, the scrape of silverware, the low murmur of servants, the faint tick of the grandfather clock, seemed amplified, suspended in anticipation. The will reading was scheduled for 10 o'clock. By 9:30, the guests were already arriving, aunts with judgment in their eyes, cousins dressed in shades of respectful greed, and distant associates who came not out of affection, but curiosity. I watched from the staircase as they filled the living room, polished wood floors, high ceilings, light streaming through sheer curtains that softened nothing. Vivian was at the center of it all, of course, every gesture deliberate, every smile calculated. She wore black again, this time a designer dress that looked like mourning dipped in vanity. Grant hovered nearby, whispering something that made her laugh. She looked radiant, victorious. When she finally noticed me descending the stairs, her smile didn't falter. "Ah, Serena," she said, projecting her voice just enough for everyone to hear. "You made it. I was starting to think you'd rather skip the formalities." "I wouldn't miss it," I replied evenly. Mr. Halbrook stood by the fireplace, a leather briefcase in his hands. He was an older man, discreet and careful, the kind of lawyer who measured every word before speaking it. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "thank you for joining us today for the reading of Mr. Adrian Delaney's last will and testament." The murmur in the room quieted. I took a seat near the back, across from Vivian, who was perched beside Grant like a queen awaiting her coronation. Halbrook adjusted his glasses and began reading. His voice was steady, monotone, legal precision laced with finality. "To my eldest daughter, Vivian Delaney, I leave the sum of $5 million, as well as my majority shares in Delaney Holdings." Vivian's lips curved upward. She didn't even try to hide it. "To my nephew, Charles Delaney, I leave—" The rhythm continued. Names, assets, bequests, a tapestry of wealth carefully divided, each stitch favoring Vivian. When my name finally appeared, it was brief. To my younger daughter, Serena Delaney, I leave a trust of $50,000 to be distributed at the discretion of the executor. A polite gasp rippled through the room. Vivian's smirk grew almost imperceptibly wider. Around me, relatives shifted uncomfortably, their glances full of pity disguised as politeness. I met none of their eyes. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, expression neutral. I'd expected this. Vivian had spent years convincing Father that I didn't belong, that I was the mistake he could only redeem by keeping me at a distance. Halbrook continued reading, paragraph after paragraph, each one an affirmation of Vivian's triumph. When he reached the end of the main document, he paused, cleared his throat, and carefully closed the folder. That concludes the primary testament, he said. Vivian straightened, exhaling softly, the way someone does. After winning a marathon, they never doubted finishing first. Thank you, Mr. Halbrook, she said graciously. I'm relieved it's finally official. But the lawyer didn't respond immediately. He placed the folder on the table, then reached into his briefcase again. There is, he said slowly, an additional matter. The room shifted. Conversations froze mid-breath. Vivian's head turned sharply. What do you mean, additional? Halbrook withdrew a smaller folder sealed with a red wax emblem. Your father left a sealed addendum to his will, dated 2 weeks before his passing. It was delivered to my office by his personal assistant. Vivian's composure cracked for the first time. That's impossible. The will was finalized last year. I sat with him when he signed it. The lawyer nodded, his expression unreadable. Indeed, he did. However, a codicil, an amendment, was later drafted and properly notarized. I could feel the air in the room tighten. Every eye turned toward Vivian. She laughed, brittle and disbelieving. No, that's absurd. My father wasn't capable of making changes at that point. He was on medication. He didn't even leave the house. Halbrook raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Delaney, the dates and witness signatures are quite clear. The codicil was executed during a lucid period, in the presence of 2 legal witnesses and a notary public. Her face went pale, but she tried to recover. Then it must be a misunderstanding. I'll have my attorney review it before. That won't be necessary, he interrupted gently. By law, this addendum is part of the testament and will be read today. The silence that followed was almost physical, pressing down on everyone in the room. I sat motionless, watching Vivian's carefully curated world begin to tremble. Halbrook broke the seal with a deliberate hand, sliding the papers out. This document supersedes all previous arrangements regarding the distribution of property and estate holdings. Vivian's nails dug into the armrest of her chair. You're making a mistake, she whispered. He didn't answer. For a moment I thought of my father, how his hands trembled when he last held mine, how he'd looked me in the eye and said, "Wait." And I had waited. Every insult, every humiliation, every condescending smile had been the pause before this moment. Halbrook's voice was steady as he unfolded the page, the rustle of parchment filling the silence. Vivian's husband leaned forward. "What's in it?" he demanded. Halbrook adjusted his glasses again. "In due time, Mr. Langford. First, I must confirm its validity." He took his time, checking the notary's stamp, the witnesses' signatures, his own seal. The precision was agonizing, each second stretching longer than the last. Vivian's breathing had grown uneven. Her control was slipping. She reached for her water glass but didn't drink. Across the table, I lifted my teacup, its porcelain rim cool against my fingers. The faint tremor in my hand wasn't fear. It was restraint. Halbrook finally spoke again. "Your father's final wish," he said, "was that this codicil be read in its entirety before all immediate family members present." Vivian found her voice. "My father would never—" "Miss Delaney," he said firmly, "your father's instructions were explicit." Her mouth snapped shut. The lawyer turned the page, eyes scanning the text. "This document will alter the previous division of assets significantly. If there are any objections, they can be raised after the reading." No one spoke. The silence was so taut it hummed. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly, as if the world itself was listening. Halbrook cleared his throat and began to read. Vivian's head turned toward me, and for the first time, she truly looked afraid. I set my teacup back on the saucer, slowly, deliberately. The porcelain clicked against the glass tabletop. Quiet, precise, final. Inside, I felt something sharp and thrilling begin to unfold. I clasped my cup tighter, suppressing the smile threatening to rise. She has no idea how deep Father's shadow still rules this house. Mr. Holbrook's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the document. Even he seemed to understand the gravity of what he was about to read. The room had gone still. No clinking cups, no whispers, no movement. Every face, every breath was turned toward him. He adjusted his glasses and began. I, Adrian Delaney, being of sound mind and judgment, do hereby make the following amendments to my last will and testament. The words seemed to slice through the silence. It is my decision that the Delaney mansion, along with all properties and controlling shares in Delaney Holdings, be transferred in full to my younger daughter, Serena Delaney. The air was ripped from the room. A gasp broke from someone near the back. Another dropped their glass, the sound of shattering crystal echoing like a gunshot. I didn't move. I couldn't. For a moment, the weight of those words pressed against my chest until I could hardly breathe. Then, like a tide receding, the shock rolled back, and I saw Vivian, her face drained of color, lips parted, eyes wide, with disbelief. Then fury surged behind her expression, and she shot to her feet. "No," she hissed. "No, that's not possible. That's not true." Halbrook didn't flinch. "The codicil is dated and notarized 2 weeks before your father's passing. All necessary legal procedures were observed." "This is a forgery," she screamed. "He couldn't have changed anything. He was sick. He wasn't even lucid by then." Halbrook looked up, his tone professional, but his eyes sharp. "Your father was examined and declared mentally competent by his physician prior to the signing. There are witness statements attached." The room erupted in low murmurs. Shock, curiosity, disbelief. I sat perfectly still, my heart beat loud in my ears, but my expression unreadable. Vivian's husband Grant stood too, his jaw clenched. "You expect us to believe he just handed everything over to her? To her?" "I expect you to believe the truth," Halbrook said calmly. "Your father's instructions were explicit." Vivian turned to me then, her eyes burning. "You did this?" I met her gaze without blinking. "Did what?" "You manipulated him. You waited until he was weak. Then you—" "Vivian," Halbrook interrupted, "you're accusing your father's legal witnesses of fraud. Be very careful." Her hand trembled as she pointed toward the papers. "I want proof. I want to see every page, every signature. I want—" Before she could finish, I opened my bag slowly, deliberately. The movement drew every gaze in the room. From inside, I withdrew the envelope, the one I had found in Father's study. The parchment was aged, his handwriting distinct. I held it up. "You want proof?" I said softly. "Then look." Halbrook's eyes widened slightly as he stepped forward. I handed him the envelope. He opened it, compared the seal, then nodded solemnly. "This matches the copy held in my firm's archive. The handwriting, the notary's initials, everything is consistent." Vivian took a step back, her voice breaking. No, this can't be happening." Grant muttered something under his breath, too low for anyone to hear, then turned away, his hands tightening into fists. Halbrook cleared his throat and continued reading the rest of the document, though the room barely heard him. Every word only confirmed what Vivian already knew, that the empire she'd spent her life claiming had slipped completely from her grasp. By the time he finished, the silence felt heavy enough to crush the air. Vivian's voice came out low, strangled. "He wouldn't do this to me." I stood finally, the scrape of my chair loud against the marble floor. "He did," I said, "because he finally saw who you are." Her face twisted. "You don't deserve any of this." "Neither did you," I replied. She took a step toward me, her eyes wild. "You planned this. You've been plotting for years, waiting for him to die." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I didn't have to plan anything, Vivian. You did it for me. Every cruel word, every lie you told him about me, every chance you took to humiliate me, it all brought him here." For a long, suspended moment, we stared at each other. Her fury was volcanic. Mine was ice. Behind her, I noticed the staff gathered quietly near the doorway, Elena among them. Their eyes met mine, and one by one, they bowed their heads slightly. Not out of duty, but recognition. Vivian saw it too, that subtle shift in allegiance. The house that had always obeyed her was changing in real time. Her voice cracked. You think they'll follow you? You think anyone will respect you? You're nothing but... Careful, I interrupted. You're speaking to the owner of this house. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Grant finally spoke, stepping between us. Vivian, he said quietly, let it go. Let it go, she snapped. She's taking everything. He glanced at me, then back at her. There was something ugly in his expression. Fear, maybe, or calculation. It's done. Yelling won't change it. She turned on him, betrayal twisting her features. You're siding with her? I'm siding with reality, he said coldly. For the first time in her life, Vivian looked small. All her elegance, all her poise. It crumbled under the weight of losing control. Her voice shook. This house was mine. I took a step closer, close enough that she could see how calm I was. You said I'd never belong here, I whispered. Now you're trespassing. Her breath hitched. The words hung between us, heavy and irreversible. Halbrook gathered his papers quietly, his job complete. Unless there are any further objections, he said, I'll see to the legal transfers immediately. Vivian didn't respond. She stood frozen, her knuckles white against the back of the chair. Then, suddenly, she snapped. I'll destroy you, she screamed, her voice echoing through the room. Do you hear me, Serena? I'll ruin everything you touch. I didn't flinch. I just looked at her, almost pitying her desperation. You already did that to yourself, I said. Grant caught her arm as she tried to lunge forward, holding her back. Enough, he hissed. The lawyer turned to me. Miss Delaney. Mrs. Delaney, Vivian spat. No, Halbrook corrected gently. That title now belongs to your sister. Vivian's face went blank, as if the words had struck something vital inside her. I looked down at my teacup, now cold, and lifted it once more. My reflection shimmered faintly in the surface. I took a slow sip, my voice barely a whisper. Some things taste better cold. Her glare burned into me, full of venom and promise. This isn't over, she said, her tone low and dangerous. You think you've won, but I'll make you regret every second of this. I met her. Gazed and smiled. Small, sharp, certain. Then you'd better start trying, sister. The house had always been Vivian's kingdom, but now it was quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet, like the stillness that comes after a storm when you can still smell the rain. After the reading of the will, the guests disappeared quickly. The shock lingered, thick in the air, but no one dared challenge it. By the following morning, only Vivian, Grant, and I remained inside the mansion's walls. She refused to leave. Her suitcases stayed untouched in her room. Her perfume still lingered in the hallways, her voice echoing faintly through the corridors as she issued orders that no one followed anymore. I didn't push her. Not yet. I told Mr. Halbrook I'd give her a few days to adjust. He nodded, though I could tell he didn't approve. But patience was a weapon I'd learned to sharpen well. The staff, however, didn't need convincing. They shifted to me naturally, silently, without prompting. Elena oversaw the change with quiet efficiency. Menus altered, room assignments updated, security codes reset. The subtle machinery of loyalty turned, and within 2 days, the mansion breathed with a new rhythm. Vivian noticed. Every morning she descended the stairs, expecting the usual chorus of greetings, and received only polite silence. Her commands were met with calm deferrals. Her coffee arrived late, her preferred seat at breakfast already occupied, by me. The first time it happened, she froze mid-step, eyes darting toward me. I pretended not to notice. Morning, I said mildly, sipping my tea. Her lips trembled. You're in Father's seat. I looked at the chair, then back at her. I suppose I am. It was a small thing, but I watched the fury flicker in her eyes like a match. Over the next few days, I began to restore the house. Not to Vivian's sterile perfection, but to memory. My mother's photographs, long removed from the walls, returned to their rightful places. Her piano was tuned again. Her scent, faint lavender and cedar, drifted back into the air. The mansion no longer belonged to Vivian's image. It was becoming something else, something alive, something mine. But Vivian's paranoia grew with each passing day. She stopped eating with the family, preferring to seclude herself in her bedroom or her father's old office. I heard her voice at night, shouting through the walls at Grant, accusing him of betrayal, of cowardice, of letting the bastard child steal everything. She became convinced the will had been forged. I knew because she hired her own investigator, someone discreet, she thought. Elena overheard the phone call and told me quietly while refilling my tea. I didn't confront Vivian about it. Instead, I maintained the same composure that infuriated her most. I smiled when I passed her in the hallway, offered her tea in the evenings, and treated her as though nothing had changed. Once, when I brought a tray into her room, she glared at me with red-rimmed eyes. "You think you've won?" she said. I set the tray down gently beside her untouched breakfast. "I don't think," I said. "I know." The silence that followed was icy. Later that afternoon, Grant found me in the conservatory. The light filtered through the glass roof, painting patterns across the marble floor. He approached with that same rehearsed charm that used to fool everyone, but not me. "Serena," he said smoothly, "you've handled all this remarkably well. I mean that sincerely." I didn't look up from the book I was reading. "Do you?" He chuckled. "Of course. Look, Vivian's emotional right now. Losing her father, the house, everything, it's difficult. I was hoping we could find a way to make this easier for everyone." "Everyone," I repeated. "You mean her." He raised his hand slightly. "I'm being pragmatic. You've won. No one's disputing that. But what if we reached a settlement? Something generous, a one-time arrangement. You'd still keep the company and the house, obviously, but maybe she could live off my generosity," I asked, closing the book. He smiled carefully. "Let's call it a gesture of goodwill." "Grant," I said softly, "are you speaking for Vivian or yourself?" He blinked, just long enough for the silence to give me my answer. "I'd hate to think," I continued, "that you're looking for a new source of comfort now that her fortune has evaporated." He started to protest, but I interrupted. "You know, it's strange. Father's lawyer told me something interesting about the codicil. Apparently, it includes not only the mansion and holdings, but also a clause about any financial manipulation or coercion attempted by parties within the family." Grant froze. "Yes," I said. "It's all quite detailed." He shifted uneasily. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" I asked, leaning forward. "Because if I were, this would be an odd time to be recording our conversation." He stared at me. Then his eyes flicked toward the small silver pen sitting on the table beside me. A red light blinked faintly. I smiled. "I'm thorough, Grant. Always have been." His mouth opened, then closed. Without another word, he turned and left. That night, I found Vivian in the gallery, standing before one of Father's portraits. The glass lay shattered at her feet, shards glinting like ice. I didn't need to ask what happened. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "He loved me. You can't take that away." "I'm not trying to," I said. "I'm just reclaiming what was never yours to begin with." Her shoulders shook. "You forged it. You tricked him. You poisoned him against me." I sighed softly. "If that were true, the documents would have fallen apart the moment you challenged them. But they didn't. And you know why?" Finally she turned. Her eyes were wild. "Because you're lucky." "No," I said, stepping closer. "Because I learned from you." Her face twisted, and before I could stop her, she grabbed one of the vases, an antique from my mother's collection, and hurled it to the floor. It shattered into 100 glittering pieces. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I said quietly, "You just destroyed the last thing Father ever kept of her." Something flickered across her face. Regret, maybe. But it was gone as soon as it came. She stormed out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. By morning, the eviction notice was signed. I had it delivered to her door with a restraining order attached. I didn't want another scene. I wanted silence. When she read it, I expected rage, but what I saw instead was something worse: defeat. Her mask finally slipped. All the poise, the arrogance, the control. It crumbled until all that was left was a woman realizing the empire she built on cruelty had turned to dust. She looked up at me, eyes hollow. "You'll regret this, Serena." I met her gaze, calm and certain. "No," I said. "You will." I turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. "You still don't know the full truth," I whispered. Her breath caught, but I didn't look back. The silence that followed was deafening. 3 days after the eviction notice was served, I received a call from Mr. Halbrook. His tone was measured, but there was something in it, something that hinted he'd been waiting for this conversation. "Miss Delaney," he said, "there's a matter I believe we should discuss privately. It concerns a clause in your father's estate documents that was not publicly read during the initial session." I paused, pen frozen above the signature line of a restoration invoice I'd been reviewing. "Another clause?" "Yes," he said. "Your father left what we call a secondary provision, an automatic conditional directive, to be enacted only under specific circumstances." "Let me guess," I murmured. "Vivian." There was a small exhale on the other end. "Yes, may I visit you this afternoon?" I agreed. When he arrived, the mansion was bathed in cold sunlight. The marble floors gleamed like ice, the air thick with the scent of polish and lavender from the reopened parlor. Vivian's presence had already begun to fade, her perfume replaced by silence, her authority by mine. Halbrook stepped into the study, removing his hat and gloves. He looked older than he had during the will reading, as though he too had carried the weight of this family's shadows for years. "Please," I said, motioning toward Father's chair. "Sit." He shook his head gently. "That seat belongs to you now." I took it, because I knew he was right. He opened his briefcase, withdrew a sealed envelope, and placed it on the desk between us. The same red wax insignia glowed faintly in the morning light. "This," he said, "is your father's final directive. He called it a safeguard. I believe you'll find it comprehensive." I broke the seal carefully and unfolded the document. My father's handwriting stared back at me. Strong, deliberate, the script of a man who never left anything to chance. I began to read. "Should any heir to my estate contest, dispute, or publicly defame the validity of this will or any of its clauses, that individual shall forfeit all inheritance, financial claims, and privileges associated with the Delaney name. All assets under said heir's name, jointly or independently held within family trusts, are to be liquidated and transferred to my daughter, Serena Delaney." My throat tightened. "This clause exists," it continued, "not out of cruelty, but clarity. A legacy cannot be divided by arrogance. Those who believe themselves entitled will learn that blood alone is not inheritance." I looked up slowly. "She's already done it," I said. Halbrook nodded. "The moment your sister accused you of forgery in front of witnesses, the clause activated automatically. I filed the certification this morning." I leaned back, the chair creaking softly. "So it's official." "Yes," he said. "You now own the entirety of the Delaney estate, every asset, property, and corporate share. Legally, irrevocably." I exhaled, long and slow. The victory didn't feel triumphant, just inevitable. Vivian's empire, the one she'd built on Father's neglect and manipulation, had imploded by her own hand. The irony was exquisite. Halbrook hesitated, as if deciding whether to speak. "Miss Delaney, your father foresaw this. He told me once that he expected the two of you would face each other someday. He said, 'Serena won't need my protection, only my patience.'" I smiled faintly. He was right. When Halbrook left, I sat for a long time, staring at the empty chair across from me, the one Vivian used to occupy during family meetings, where she'd speak for him as if she were his voice. Now it sat silent. That afternoon, word spread fast. The legal networks, the social circles, Delaney Holdings was gossip gold. Within hours, Vivian's face appeared on the finance blogs and gossip pages, her reputation dissected like a carcass. Contest backfires. Eldest Delaney daughter disinherited after dispute. Vivian Langford loses fortune. Faces legal fallout. The photographs they used were brutal. Vivian caught mid-scream during the will reading. Eyes wild, mascara streaking like war paint. Grant vanished the same day. I wasn't surprised. He'd always been more parasite than partner, feeding off her status and wealth. Once the accounts froze, so did his loyalty. Elena informed me that he'd packed his bags before sunrise and left without a word. Later I learned he'd filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. In truth, he simply couldn't stand next to a fallen queen. By evening, I received a message. Vivian. It came through the house intercom. She was still in the guest wing, refusing to leave. Her voice, once so poised, was brittle and raw. "Serena," she said, "we need to talk." I hesitated, then pressed the button. What could you possibly have left to say? A pause. "Please." When I entered the room, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, dressed simply for once. No silk, no jewelry, just exhaustion. Her eyes were swollen, her hands trembling. "I didn't know about the clause," she whispered. "He didn't tell me." "He didn't tell you," I repeated, "because he didn't trust you." Tears welled in her eyes. "You have everything now. The house, the company, even his name. What do you want from me?" I regarded her quietly. The woman before me was no longer the invincible sister who'd once ruled this house like a queen. She looked fragile, hollow, almost transparent. "Nothing," I said. "You always wanted my silence, Vivian. Now it's yours." Her shoulders shook. "You're enjoying this." I shook my head. "You mistake satisfaction for joy." She stood, unsteady. "I'll leave, but this house will haunt you. Father will haunt you." I smiled faintly. "He already does, but not the way you think." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she gathered her coat and walked past me, her footsteps soft on the carpet. At the door, she paused. "Was it worth it?" she asked. I turned slightly. "Ask yourself that." When she was gone, the mansion seemed to exhale. The walls felt lighter. Even the ticking of the clock softened, as though the house itself recognized its new rhythm. The next morning, newspapers printed her name again, this time beside words like disgraced, bankrupt, estranged. Her friends distanced themselves. Invitations vanished. In a world obsessed with appearances, she had become invisible. And I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply restored order. In the evening, I walked through the empty hallways, the golden light of sunset spilling through the tall windows. My footsteps echoed softly across the marble floors. Every portrait, every polished surface reflected a fragment of my face and his. Father's shadow was still here, but now it stood beside me, not over me. In the study, I stopped before his portrait and looked into his painted eyes. For the first time, they didn't seem cold. "You told me to wait," I whispered. "I did." The silence answered, vast and comforting. I turned away, my reflection following in the dark glass of the window. Outside, the garden shimmered faintly in the fading light, free at last from her voice, her perfume, her poison. "Be patient," he'd said. I smiled to myself. I was. The rain had been falling since dawn, thin, steady, and relentless, the kind of rain that blurred the world beyond the windows into muted shades of gray. I sat in my father's chair, the same one where he'd made every decision that shaped this family and listened to the rhythm of water against glass. For years, I had imagined sitting here, not as a guest, not as the tolerated half-sister, but as the rightful heir. Now that I was, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like balance. The study smelled faintly of cedar and ink, the way it always had. I ran my fingertips across the edge of his desk, tracing the grooves carved by decades of use. He had signed contracts here, built empires here, and from this same chair, he'd once looked through me like I was transparent. I closed my eyes and let the memories come. Vivian laughing as she locked me out of this room when I was 10. The way Father's voice hardened when he caught me in here once, asking questions about his books. The sting of hearing, "This isn't your place, Serena." I'd believed them both then, that this house wasn't mine, that I didn't deserve to exist within its walls. But now, as rain softened the sound of the world, those memories lost their edges. They didn't cut anymore. They were simply echoes, ghosts that no longer haunted. The staff moved quietly through the house, their footsteps respectful, their voices low. When I entered a room, they greeted me not with hesitation, but with calm certainty. I didn't demand loyalty, it arrived naturally. The house itself seemed to have exhaled its tension, finally aligning with the hands that truly understood it. By mid-morning, I walked through each room with Elena beside me, overseeing restorations. We removed the sterile art Vivian had hung and replaced it with portraits of our parents and of my mother, the one woman Father had loved but never had the courage to acknowledge publicly. Her photographs had been hidden in storage for years. I hung one at the top of the main staircase where Vivian's graduation photo used to be. My mother's smile, soft, knowing, alive, welcomed every visitor now. "This house feels different," Elena said as she adjusted a vase. "It feels honest," I replied. The air smelled faintly of lavender again, my mother's favorite scent. For the first time, the mansion felt like a home, not a monument to control. Around noon, Hallbrook's assistant arrived with a small parcel. She looked almost nervous handing it to me. "This came from Mr. Halbrook's office," she said. "He said it was delayed, apparently mailed before your father's passing." I took it, the weight of it oddly familiar. My name was written in Father's hand. After she left, I sat down in his chair once more and opened the envelope. Inside was a folded letter, aged slightly from travel, and sealed with his old signet stamp. I hesitated before reading. My heartbeat slowed, my throat dry. For years I'd imagined what he might have said to me if he'd had the courage. I unfolded it carefully. "My dearest Serena, if this letter has reached you, then I am gone. I've spent much of my life in silence. Not because I didn't see you, but because I didn't know how to face what you represented. My mistakes, my regrets, and everything I lacked the strength to protect. You were never a burden, though I made you feel like one. You were the reminder that I once loved fearlessly, and that terrified me. I watched you grow into a woman of restraint, of quiet fire. Vivian mistook that for weakness. I knew better. This house, this name, this legacy, they were built on control. But you will restore them with grace. You are my heir, not by blood or law, but by heart. Forgive me for the years I let you believe you didn't belong. I see you now. I always did. Father." I stared at the letter for a long time, the words blurring as the rain streaked down the windows. My hand trembled slightly as I folded it again. And then, for the first time since he'd died, I cried. Not with rage, not with bitterness, but with something raw and hollow. The tears came quietly, slipping down my face in silence. I let them fall, just long enough to release everything I'd carried since childhood. When they stopped, I felt lighter, not free, but steady. I placed the letter back into the envelope and locked it in the drawer where he once kept his favorite pen. That evening my phone buzzed. A message. "Vivian, you'll regret this." Just 3 words, simple, venomous, and entirely predictable. I stared at them for a moment, not angry, not amused. Then I deleted the message without replying. Her words no longer had gravity here. They dissolved like smoke the moment I hit delete. Later that week, I hosted a charity event in my father's name. The same hall that had once been filled with pretentious guests and empty conversation now echoed with something different. Laughter, sincerity, purpose. I spoke briefly before the donors and local press. "My father believed in legacy," I said. "But legacy isn't about what we keep. It's about what we give back." People applauded, and for the first time, I felt like I was speaking from my own foundation, not the shadow of someone else's. As the evening wound down, I stood by the tall windows overlooking the rain-soaked garden. The reflection in the glass was faint, ghostly, a merging of my face and my mother's portrait behind me. Elena approached quietly. "You've done it," she said softly. "You've given the house life again." I smiled. "Maybe it's the first time it's really been alive." She nodded and left me there, alone with the sound of rain. I turned toward the mirror across the room. An old, ornate piece Vivian once claimed was hers by right. It reflected more than just my face. It showed the weight of everything that had happened, the betrayal, the patience, the victory. For a long moment, I just stared at my reflection, watching the flicker of candlelight in my eyes. I thought about what revenge really meant. It wasn't the satisfaction of winning. It was the silence that followed, the quiet knowing that justice had already spoken and it didn't need applause. I leaned closer to the mirror, my voice barely a whisper. "Revenge doesn't heal you," I said, "but it does make you whole." Outside, thunder rolled distantly, soft and slow. The rain eased into a drizzle, and the last light of the evening broke through the clouds, painting the wet stone paths gold. I stood there a while longer, in the house that had once rejected me, listening to the sound of my own quiet breathing. And for the first time, the silence didn't scream. It sang. It had been 6 weeks since the storm finally passed. 6 weeks since Vivian walked out of this house for the last time, her heels clicking on marble that no longer echoed her name. Now the mansion was alive again, not with tension or vanity, but with quiet, dignified grace. Every wall gleamed, every hallway breathed calm. It was mine now, not through inheritance, but through reclamation. This evening, I was hosting my first formal gathering under the Delaney name. The same grand dining room where Vivian once held her court now belonged to a different kind of queen. The guests arrived in sleek black cars, their umbrellas flashing silver in the misty twilight. I greeted them at the entrance myself, not as an heiress flaunting power, but as a woman who had nothing left to prove. Miss Delaney, one of the guests, a partner from Father's company, said warmly, "The house looks magnificent. You've transformed it." I smiled. "Thank you. I've simply made it honest again." He nodded, unsure how to respond, and moved on. Inside, soft jazz played from the grand piano. Candles flickered in crystal holders, their reflections dancing across the polished oak. The air smelled faintly of bergamot and lemon, the scent of the tea I'd chosen for the night. The staff moved gracefully, trained under my quiet direction. Every detail mattered. The placement of the cups, the angle of the lights, the rhythm of movement. For years, I'd been the invisible observer, watching Vivian host these soirees like performances. Now the performance was mine, but I didn't need to act. I watched from the top of the staircase as laughter rippled through the room, light and genuine. Guests mingled easily, admiring the art, the atmosphere, the serenity. It struck me then how strange and fitting it was that peace could be so loud. Elena approached with a tray of porcelain cups, each filled with steaming golden tea. "Shall I begin serving, ma'am?" she asked softly. I took one of the cups myself. "No," I said. "I'll do it." Her brows lifted slightly, but she nodded. She understood. I descended the staircase, the same one where Vivian once stood, laughing as I'd carried a tray just like this, years ago. I remembered that day vividly, the sting of humiliation, the laughter of guests, Vivian's voice slicing through the air. "You'll never belong here." Now, standing in that exact place, the memory didn't hurt anymore. It simply fit. As I walked through the room, offering tea to the guests, I caught fragments of whispered admiration. She handled the estate beautifully, remarkably composed, given the scandal. Her sister, I heard she left the country, sold everything she owned. I placed each cup gently, my movements steady, deliberate. The sound of porcelain meeting saucer echoed softly, a delicate rhythm, almost like punctuation, marking the end of a long sentence. Near the fireplace, a television played low in the background, muted except for the faint hum of a news anchor's voice. I glanced at it briefly. Vivian's face flashed on the screen, captured by a camera somewhere overseas. The headlines scrolled beneath. "Disgraced heiress Vivian Langford sells assets, withdraws from public life." The image showed her walking through an airport alone, her once perfect posture bent under invisible weight. She wore sunglasses, but I recognized the expression, the same brittle mix of anger and denial. Someone near me whispered, "Such a shame. She had everything." I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Not everything," I murmured. I moved on, offering another cup to a woman near the window. The light caught the tea's surface, turning it gold. My reflection shimmered faintly in it. "You'll never belong here," Vivian's voice echoed again, soft and distant, like an old song fading away. I paused, letting the memory settle. She was right, in her way. I set the tray down and walked toward the large mirror that hung at the end of the hall. The same mirror I'd stood before just weeks ago, when the house was filled with silence and ghosts. My reflection met mine again, calm and complete. "You were right. I whispered. The words meant only for myself. I don't belong to your world. I built mine. Outside, the wind had softened. The rain had stopped. Moonlight filtered through the tall windows, laying silver ribbons across the marble. The guests continued to laugh and toast in the background, their voices fading to a gentle hum. I took my own cup from the tray and returned to the grand table, where the same chandelier that once illuminated Vivian's cruel smile now shone above mine. A butler approached quietly, his tone respectful. "Will you be having guests often, ma'am?" I took a slow sip of tea before answering. The flavor was smooth, fragrant, just slightly bitter. Perfect. "Only those who know their place," I said softly. He bowed and stepped back. For a long moment, I just sat there, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this. Every humiliation, every wound, every whisper that had once told me I didn't belong. It all settled around me, not as burden, but as armor. Across the room, the clock chimed. Time moved on, unhurried, obedient. I looked around. The guests, the flickering candles, the portraits restored to their rightful places, and realized the house no longer looked like hers, or even father's. It looked like mine. The walls that once excluded me now guarded me. The floors that once echoed with mockery now carried the quiet rhythm of victory. I lifted the cup again, feeling the heat against my skin, the smooth curve of porcelain between my fingers. In that moment, everything came full circle. I remembered that first evening, the sting of her words, the sound of brittle laughter, the weight of silence that followed. Now there was no sting, no mockery, only quiet satisfaction, precise and complete. I raised the cup slightly, as if in a silent toast, to patience, to truth, to the kind of revenge that didn't need to shout. My voice was barely more than a breath. "While I served tea," I said, "she thought she owned this house. Now every sip tastes like my victory." The chandelier light caught the surface of the tea, turning it gold one last time. The music swelled gently in the background, fading into a silence that wasn't empty, but whole. And as I took that final sip, I didn't think of Vivian anymore. I thought of my mother's laughter, my father's letter, and the girl I used to be, the one who waited quietly in the shadows, serving tea to people who thought she'd never belong. Now they would all remember her name, Serena Delaney, the woman who smiled through silence and won. In the end, I didn't need to raise my voice or prove my worth to anyone. The truth had already done what revenge never could. It restored my peace. Vivian lost everything she once used to define herself, and I found everything I'd been denied. Father's house finally felt like home, not because I inherited it, but because I earned it. And as I poured one last cup of tea, I realized silence has always been my loudest victory. Some people destroy others to feel powerful, and some rebuild quietly to prove they never needed approval at all. If this story made you feel something, hit like, share it with someone who believes silence can be the sharpest revenge, and subscribe for more stories that strike the heart. But tell me this, if you were in my place, would you have forgiven your sister or let her taste the same silence she once gave you?